Mornings with Josh always felt like a quiet kind of happiness. The kind you don't question, the kind that feels solid, unshakable. I'd wake up to the warmth of his body beside me, the soft rustling of sheets as he shifted. He was always up before me, scrolling through his phone, but the moment I stirred, he'd set it aside, lean in, and press a slow kiss to my temple. "Morning, beautiful," he'd whisper, his voice still laced with sleep. I'd smile, nuzzle closer, letting myself sink into the safety of us. Evenings were just as perfect. We'd share a bottle of wine over dinner, our laughter spilling into the dimly lit kitchen. He knew me, really knew me. How I liked my tea, the way I tapped my fingers against the table when I was thinking. And when he looked at me, really looked at me, I felt seen, loved. This was the life I had always wanted, a life that felt real, unbreakable. And for the longest time, I didn't see the cracks forming beneath the surface. But then, the numbers stopped adding up. It started with something small, a charge on our joint account that I didn't recognize. "Oh, that?" Josh had laughed, brushing it off with a wave of his hand. "Bank mix-up. Already called them." It made sense. I wanted it to make sense. But then it happened again. And again. A few $100s missing, then more. I tried not to let it gnaw at me, but something didn't feel right. And then there were the late-night calls. At first, I barely noticed, but after a while, I started to see it. The way he tensed when his phone vibrated, the way he angled the screen away from me, his voice just a little too low when he answered. The first time I asked, he chuckled. "Work stuff, Nath. Go back to sleep." So I did. At least I tried. But once suspicion creeps in, it never really lets go. I told myself I was overthinking it, that I was being paranoid. But the doubt had already sunk its claws in, and no matter how hard I tried to shake it off, it lingered. I started paying closer attention, watching, listening. Josh was good, too good. His smiles were just as warm, his touch just as familiar. But now, I could feel the space between us, a sliver of something unspoken, and the more I noticed, the harder it was to ignore. Then one night, I heard him. His voice was hushed, careful, but I caught fragments. "Yeah, I know, I will soon." A pause, a low chuckle, almost affectionate, then a softer, more intimate, "I promise." My chest tightened, my mind raced. Who was he talking to? And why did it sound so personal? When I asked him about it the next morning, he barely flinched. "Just a work call," he said, casually sipping his coffee. "Late deadline, nothing serious." His tone was smooth, effortless. It should have reassured me. It didn't. I wanted to let it go. I wanted to be the kind of woman who trusted without question. But I couldn't. The seed of doubt had grown into something undeniable, and suddenly, everything felt like a performance. The way he touched me. The way he laughed at my jokes, even the way he said my name. Had it always been this way? Had I just been too blind, too in love, to see the truth? One afternoon, while he was in the shower, I did something I never thought I'd do. I reached for his phone. My hands were shaking, my pulse hammering in my ears. The screen was locked, of course. But then, as if the universe was taunting me, a message popped up. Just one. Just enough. "Same time tonight?" My stomach dropped. I stared at the message, my fingers gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles ached. "Same time tonight?" The words burned into my brain, taunting me, daring me to react. I could feel my pulse pounding in my throat, a sickening mix of fear and fury churning inside me. I wanted to unlock the phone, to see more, to rip open the illusion I had been living in, but I couldn't. Not yet. My breath was shallow, my hands trembling as I set it back down, exactly where I had found it. I forced myself to act normal. When Josh stepped out of the shower, a towel slung low around his hips, he flashed me the same easy smile he always did. "What are you up to?" he asked, ruffling his damp hair. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I smiled back, casual, effortless. "Nothing," I said, forcing a yawn. Just checking emails. It was a lie. But then again, maybe everything had been a lie. That night, I lay in bed beside him, staring at the ceiling while his slow, steady breathing filled the silence. I felt cold, detached. The weight of suspicion pressed heavy against my chest, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't push it away. I had spent years believing in this life, believing in him. But now, I wasn't sure what was real anymore. The way he held me, the way he whispered goodnight, it all felt hollow, rehearsed. A performance perfected over time. I wasn't ready to confront him, not yet. But one thing had become painfully clear. I couldn't ignore this any longer. If there was one thing I knew for certain, it was this. I had to find out the truth. The need for answers consumed me. It was no longer just suspicion. It was a gnawing certainty, an itch I couldn't ignore. So I did what any woman in my position would do. I started digging. It began with our bank statements, a rabbit hole of transactions I had never noticed before, large withdrawals, transfers to accounts I didn't recognize. The more I looked, the more my stomach twisted. It wasn't just a mistake. It wasn't some careless spending. Money had been slipping away, little by little, right under my nose. I told myself to stay calm, to be smart about this. I wasn't going to storm in and demand an explanation. Not yet. Instead, I let the days pass, pretending nothing had changed. I kissed Josh in the mornings. I laughed at his jokes. I played my role perfectly. But every time he left the house, I was one step ahead, checking records, cross-referencing dates. Piece by piece, the picture was becoming clearer. And then, one day, I made a decision. If I wanted the truth, I had to see it for myself. The plan was simple. Josh had another late meeting that night. I knew better. I waited until he left, giving him a head start before slipping into my car. My hands gripped the wheel, knuckles white as I followed at a careful distance. My heart slammed against my ribs, anticipation and dread clawing at me with every mile. Was I about to catch him with another woman? Was this what my life had come to? The drive felt endless. And then, suddenly, he pulled into a quiet neighborhood, one I had never been to before. I parked down the street, watching as he stepped out of his car. My breath caught in my throat as he walked up the driveway, his movements familiar, practiced. And then, the front door swung open. A woman stood there, smiling, waiting for him. But it wasn't just any woman. She was his wife. The air was sucked from my lungs. My body felt frozen, my mind refusing to make sense of what I was seeing. His wife, his actual wife. Not some fleeting affair, not some casual secret. She was real, standing there in the doorway of a house that was clearly theirs. She reached for him, familiar, comfortable, as if this was routine. And Josh, my Josh, stepped forward, wrapping his arms around her, pressing a lingering kiss to her lips like a husband coming home. I wanted to look away, to blink and realize this was some misunderstanding, but it wasn't. It was the truth, playing out in front of me in sharp, merciless detail. He had never belonged to me. I was never his one and only. I was the other woman, the fool funding his real life while he played house with me on the side. A slow, sickening realization settled in my gut. Every "I love you" had been a lie. I could feel my heartbeat in my fingertips, a steady thrum of rage pulsing beneath my skin. I gripped the steering wheel, my nails digging into the leather. My mind raced through every memory, every moment we had shared, now tainted by the knowledge that it was all a fabrication. The whispered promises, the plans for the future, nothing but carefully spun illusions designed to keep me exactly where he wanted me. I should have stormed out of the car. I should have screamed, confronted him right then and there. But I didn't, because a deeper part of me, one I hadn't met before, was already shifting, calculating. This wasn't just betrayal. This was fraud. And if Josh thought he could walk away from this unscathed, he had no idea what kind of woman he had underestimated. I stayed in the car for what felt like hours, my eyes never leaving the house. Josh and his wife were still inside, oblivious to the storm brewing just a few feet away. My mind was a whirlwind, trying to process the enormity of what I had just discovered. How long had this been going on? How many times had he looked me in the eye, kissed me, told me he loved me, all while leading this other life? The betrayal was overwhelming, suffocating. But something else was starting to take root, something far colder. Anger. I couldn't just sit there, a passive witness to my own humiliation. I couldn't let him get away with this, not after everything. I had been a fool, yes, but I wouldn't be a victim. Not anymore. I pulled out of the driveway slowly, carefully, making sure not to make a sound. As I drove home, my fingers flexed around the steering wheel, each grip more determined than the last. He had no idea what was coming. I waited. Days passed, and I did what I needed to do, quietly, methodically. I went through our records again, all the things he'd tried to hide: bank statements, credit cards, emails. The connections started to weave together, and each new piece of information made the web of deception grow wider. It wasn't just money he had taken from me. It was trust. It was time. It was everything I had believed about us. But I wasn't about to confront him, not yet. I had a plan. I would make sure Josh paid for what he had done, and I would make sure he would never be able to do this to anyone again. But for now, I had to stay quiet. I had to pretend, to keep up the facade. After all, I had been playing a role for so long. The least I could do was finish the performance. I spent the next few weeks in silence, letting the anger fester just beneath the surface. Every time Josh looked at me, kissed me, or made some casual comment, all I could think about was the other woman, the real woman, waiting for him. But I didn't confront him, not yet. I wasn't ready to lose control. I was playing a long game now, and I was going to win. I started moving money out of our joint accounts, little by little, making sure Josh wouldn't notice. Transfers, shifts in investments, even small withdrawals here and there that seemed insignificant at first glance. It was meticulous, but I was patient. I was careful. I had to make sure there was nothing he could trace back to me. I wasn't just protecting myself, I was setting a trap. I also started gathering evidence. The texts I had found on his phone weren't a fluke. There was more, so much more, hidden in the depths of our shared life. I kept notes, took pictures, saved everything. His lies were stacked so high, I could barely keep track of them. And as much as I hated it, I felt a strange sense of satisfaction. He had betrayed me, but I was going to be the one who walked away with the last laugh. Then came the moment I had been waiting for. I reached out to her, the first wife. I had no idea how she would react, but I didn't care. He had played us both. She deserved to know the truth, just like I had. I spent hours crafting the perfect message, careful not to say too much, just enough to pique her curiosity. When I hit send, I felt the weight of everything finally start to shift. The message I sent her was simple, almost detached. Just the facts. A few key details that would be enough to start unraveling everything Josh had built. The kind of message that didn't scream rage, but quietly screamed truth. I knew she would want answers. Who wouldn't, after discovering that her husband had been living a double life for years? I could almost feel her anxiety through the screen, her curiosity, her need to know. I didn't wait for her to reply. Instead, I focused on what came next, his financial downfall. I knew that if I hit him where it hurt, I could make him suffer the way he had made me suffer. I made sure he couldn't touch a single cent of my money anymore. I closed accounts, transferred everything into my name. Each move was calculated, deliberate. It wasn't enough to just expose him. I wanted to destroy the life he had been living off of me, the life he had taken for granted. I kept up the act, of course. He had no idea what was happening behind the scenes. He came home every night, kissed me like everything was fine, and I played my part. I pretended to be the loving wife, the one who had no idea what was coming for her. But with every passing day, my plan was falling into place. His secrets were no longer his to keep. And then came the legal trap. Fraud charges were already in the back of my mind, but I needed more than just money to bring him down. I wanted him exposed. I wanted him humiliated. I started talking to lawyers, researching every angle I could use to make him regret every single lie he'd told me. With each conversation, I felt more powerful, more in control, and when the time was right, I would strike. The days that followed felt like a slow, methodical countdown. Josh had no idea what was brewing beneath the surface. He was too busy with his own lies, too consumed with the other life he was leading to even notice that the walls were closing in around him. I watched him, and for the first time I saw him clearly. Really saw him. He was weak, a man who thought he could get away with anything, that nothing would touch him. But he was wrong. The first wife responded. Her message was as raw as I expected it to be, shocked, confused, angry. She demanded proof. I didn't hesitate. I sent everything I had, pictures, bank statements, text messages. I laid it all out for her, the cruel evidence of his betrayal. And as I read her words, her disbelief, her heartbreak, something stirred inside me. I had no sympathy for her. She was part of the lie, too. But I couldn't deny that her pain mirrored my own. We were both victims, and in some twisted way, that made me feel less alone. But there was no turning back now. I had made my decision, and nothing was going to stop me. I had already set the wheels in motion, and I wasn't about to let Josh off the hook. As his financial empire started to crumble, I made sure to tighten the noose. I sent copies of everything to his workplace, to his colleagues, anyone who would listen. The man who had carefully constructed his life on lies was about to be exposed for who he truly was. When I finally confronted him, I was calm. Too calm. He didn't know what hit him. Josh had always been a man of quick words, but now his defenses were useless. I looked him in the eye, and with every word I spoke, I could see the realization hitting him. The game was over. He had no escape. I wasn't the woman he had manipulated anymore. I was the one who held all the cards. Josh's world began to unravel faster than he could comprehend. One by one, the things he thought he could rely on, his reputation, his power, his lies, slipped through his fingers like sand. The first wife was done. She left him without hesitation, her departure swift and unforgiving. I wasn't surprised. After all, she had been living in a shadow of the truth, just like me. But seeing him lose her, watching the man who once controlled everything now collapse in on himself, was oddly satisfying. I didn't have to lift a finger to make it happen. She took the children, took everything, and left him broken. And then came the financial blow. Josh, who had always been the one to manipulate numbers, was now drowning in debt. His access to our joint accounts had been severed. He couldn't touch a single dollar of my money. Not that he deserved it. Every penny he had taken from me was now gone, and I knew it would only be a matter of time before the legal mess began to take its toll. I made sure of that. I contacted his creditors, made sure every lie he'd built was exposed to the people who mattered most. His financial ruin was just the beginning, but it was enough to send him into a spiral. Josh went from a man who seemed untouchable to someone barely able to keep his head above water. He was now scrambling for anything to keep from sinking further. But by the time he realized how deep the hole was, it was too late. And then came the final confrontation. I had waited for this moment, prepared for it. He begged, he pleaded. The man who had once held me in the palm of his hand now groveled before me, broken and desperate. "Please, Natalie," he whispered, his voice trembling with a kind of vulnerability I had never seen before. "I'm sorry, I was wrong. I'll make it right." But there was no making it right, not anymore. His words were hollow, a pitiful attempt to claw his way back into my life. The same words he had used when things were good, when he needed something from me. "Please, Natalie, forgive me," he begged again, his eyes pleading as if they could somehow undo the damage. But I wasn't the same woman who had once melted at the sight of those desperate eyes. I wasn't the woman who had believed every word he said. I stood there, silent for a moment, letting the weight of his words sink in. The silence between us was thick, charged with years of manipulation, betrayal, and regret. It was no longer about what he had done to me. It was about who I had become because of it. The woman standing before him now wasn't broken. She was stronger. She was smarter. And she wasn't about to let him destroy her anymore. "You lied to me," I said, my voice steady, colder than I thought I could sound. You used me, and now I'm the one leaving you with nothing. I watched as the color drained from his face, the reality of it hitting him all at once. This wasn't some fleeting argument, some momentary loss of control. This was the end of everything he had known, the end of the life he had taken from me. Josh's face twisted with emotion, desperation, regret, guilt, but it was too little, too late. I had already walked away from him in my mind long before I'd ever physically left. His apologies, his promises, they didn't matter anymore. The man I had loved had died the moment I discovered the truth. What stood before me now was a shell of a man, begging for mercy he no longer deserved. I turned to leave, my steps slow but resolute, every part of me determined to put this chapter behind me. I didn't need to watch him break down further. I knew he would. It was the least he deserved after everything. As I walked away, I heard him call my name, his voice breaking, but I didn't stop. There was no going back now. I didn't want to remember the man I had once loved, the man who held my hand, whispered promises, and told me we'd grow old together. That man was gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized, a man who had traded our future for a secret life, a man who thought he could control me, a man who didn't even realize the power I had over him now. What happened next was inevitable. As Josh's life crumbled, I watched from a distance, but I didn't feel pity. There was no satisfaction in his suffering, at least, not anymore. What I felt was something more complex, something I hadn't expected. Peace. It was over. The war I had been fighting for so long had ended, and I was the one who had won. I was free. But freedom, as I quickly realized, didn't come without its own weight. I had to rebuild, had to heal, and that was something I hadn't fully prepared for. There was a part of me that still missed him, the version of him that had been kind, that had loved me. But I couldn't hold on to that. I couldn't let the past pull me back. I had learned too much, felt too much, to go back to a life of lies. Walking away from Josh felt like shedding a skin I didn't even know I was wearing. It wasn't just about leaving him. It was about leaving the version of myself that had let him control me, the one who had been blinded by love and trust. That woman was gone, and in her place stood someone stronger, wiser, and for the first time in a long while, completely free. But with freedom came uncertainty. What now? What do you do when the life you thought was yours is stripped away, when everything you believed in turns out to be a lie? The weight of the question hung over me for weeks, every day another step into the unknown. I had been so focused on my revenge, on the satisfaction of watching him lose everything, that I hadn't stopped to think about myself. And then, one day, I did. I took a long look at myself in the mirror. The woman staring back at me wasn't the same person who had stood by Josh all those years. She was different, calmer, sharper, more confident. She had been through a fire, but she hadn't burned. She had survived. I didn't know exactly what my future would look like, but I knew one thing for sure. I was done living for someone else. I was done being the afterthought, the second choice. Whatever came next, I would build it on my terms. And that thought, for the first time in so long, gave me peace. As time went on, I found myself looking at the world through a different lens. I had been so focused on the destruction Josh left in his wake that I hadn't seen the opportunities waiting for me to seize. Life had a way of presenting itself again, offering small moments of peace in the chaos. I began doing things I hadn't done in years, things I used to love but had let go of. I spent mornings at the park, reading, breathing in the fresh air that now felt so much more vibrant. I started going to yoga classes again, something I'd given up long ago. But there was one thing I couldn't ignore: the need to warn others. To make sure Josh could never hurt anyone the way he had hurt me. It didn't feel like vengeance anymore. It felt like justice. I started reaching out to women's groups, sharing my story anonymously at first, knowing how careful I had to be. I didn't want to risk Josh coming after me, but I also didn't want him to go on living the lie. And then one day, a woman reached out to me. She told me her story, how Josh had done the same thing to her, how he had lied, manipulated, and taken from her just as he had taken from me. The anger I thought I had buried rushed back, but this time it wasn't just for me. It was for all the women he had used and discarded, for the lives he had ruined in his selfishness. That moment made everything feel real. I wasn't alone anymore. I wasn't the only one he had hurt, and as we shared our stories, I knew what I had to do next. Josh's secret life would be exposed, not just to the people he had used, but to the world. He would never be able to hurt anyone again, not while I was standing in the way. As the days passed, I grew more resolute in my mission. I didn't need revenge anymore. I needed closure. For myself, for the women who had suffered at Josh's hands, for all of us who had been made to feel small, insignificant, and deceived. I knew the truth about him now, and that truth was powerful. It couldn't stay hidden. I started gathering everything I had, documents, texts, photos, and I compiled them into a report that would leave nothing to chance. This wasn't about getting back at him anymore. This was about ensuring he never had the chance to do this again. I contacted a journalist, someone I trusted to handle the story carefully. I needed it out there, but I also needed it to be done right. This wasn't just about bringing Josh down. It was about giving a voice to those he had silenced. As the pieces of his life were slowly pulled apart in the media, I watched from a distance, but there was no satisfaction anymore. There was only the quiet knowledge that I had done the right thing, that I had fought back and won. Josh's world fell apart in ways he never anticipated. His name was dragged through the mud, his lies exposed to anyone who would listen. The women he had deceived found each other, and together, we made sure his manipulations were no longer hidden. He tried to fight back, of course, he always did, but the walls were too high, and he had built them all himself. No one was buying his story anymore. And me? I finally started to live again. I moved to a new city, found a job I loved, and began building a life that was entirely mine. I didn't need to hold on to the past anymore. It wasn't about moving on, it was about moving forward. I was free. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough.